My friends, I can't tell you, I am so excited. I'm so excited to be here with you in this moment. What a total honor and privilege it is. Thank you again, thank you to everybody that organized this. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you all for being here and giving me your ears and your mind right now. What a total honor. What a total honor. And, I'm really going to start giving the talk in a second, but I have to say this too, which is one of the reasons that I feel the pressure that I am feeling right now is because once upon a time, a long, long time ago, I was a student in post-standards class. And a thing that Paul told me then that I have never forgotten, I mean, everybody takes what they need, right, from every class, and Paul gives so much. And Paul, I don't know why this came up, but it was exactly what I needed, which is he told me, if somebody gives you a microphone, you better have something to say. No pressure. So I'm trying to have something to say. All right, so the talk is listening from the edges. Every periphery is a center. And when I came up with that, I was thinking about this. You don't need to read this whole thing, but this is an artwork by an artist collective that is incredibly inspirational for me. They're named Related Tactics. And this image that you're seeing and not probably really being able to read, the most important part is at the top. In our world, we are whole. This is a takeaway from an exhibition called A Two-Way Mirror, Double Consciousness in Contemporary Glass by Black artists. That's curated by Jabari Owens-Bailey, and it's up at the Museum of Glass, Tacoma right now, all the way until next October, so you can go and see it. And what I think is so amazing, I mean, I learned so much all the time from Related Tactics. I was so lucky to work on a project with them for the last couple of years. And one of the many things that I learned from them and that I think is really important in this kind of context and in a flameworking context within the greater sphere of glass is this idea that in our world we are whole. And the very top line that says only within whiteness are people of color on the margins. We are the center of our world, right? And I don't know, I hope you don't feel like this, but sometimes in my life and in my career in glass, and as a person that was a flame worker and now is whatever I am, I sometimes hear from flame workers in particular about the history of the technique and its role and importance in relationship to other glass, and I am here to tell you that, well, right now, especially, we are in the center of the world, and who cares what else there is outside? So now I've given you a little bit more of my perspective already than I meant to. But I don't usually share so much of my background, but I feel like we're in family, and maybe it's important, as I am in this move from center and periphery right now, having left the Corning Museum, and still being in Corning means that I am both in the center and on the periphery at the same time. Now, I already mentioned to you that I was a flame worker once upon a time. In fact, this image was taken 22 years ago. I didn't know about the IFC then, but this is me at the Penland School of Crafts. I also made the t-shirt. And I had gone down there. I had gone down there from University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I was studying glass. I ended up at Penland at that time by accident. I ended up there because September 11th happened, and I had been planning to go to Bolivia to study natural dyeing and weaving, and the Bolivian government and also my parents thought that was no longer a good idea in the wake of September 11th. Oh, but all of these guys only decided in January, and I had already moved out of my housing, and I hadn't registered for classes, and I was casting about for what to do. And I ended up at Penland, and I ended up studying with the incomparable Dinah Hewlett. So I ended up studying Marini, and what a person to study with. She, over this 2-month-long class, she introduced us every single day. You know, this is what I told you already about things that Paul taught me, about microphones and about having something to say during our flameworking class. Who knew that I needed that? And Dinah, every morning of this 2-month-long class, would give us history lessons, 2-hour history lessons, and she would teach us about the history of glassworking in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and she would talk about the development of mosaic glass and really set the stage. I mean, who knew that I needed that? But I really needed that. I needed that as much as I needed technique. At my school, at University of Wisconsin, which had the first glass program in the country, when I was there in the late 90s and early aughts, it was kind of still like the 60s. You know, here's a blowpipe, here's the glass, you figure it out. Seemed like really cool in the 60s and less cool at that time. And I was so hungry for technique, and I was so grateful to end up in Dinah's class and be just learning that technique all the time and learning the history of that technique, which was something I never had in my university education. And one of the things that she did so incredibly was to really, and I won't do right now, but you can know and get into yourself, is how wild it is that objects like this were made before there were diamond saws. You know, how are they cutting this? How much waste happened? How did they make this so perfect? How did they get the reds and yellow glasses, the expansion of the reds and yellow glasses, so good that they could heat them up and cool them and stretch them so many times without them cracking? That can still sometimes be a challenge. And she taught us about these incredible masks in the Ptolemaic period. Oh, I forgot to tell you guys, I'm doing some history tonight. I also taught history at the Rhode Island School of History of Glass at the Rhode Island School of Glass Design for 4 years, and I guess I'm revisiting that now. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to do that. And apologies to Kate Larson, who's the curator of ancient glass at Corning, for my liberal use of the history here. These are unbelievable objects, and the thing about Marini, you know, this was the height. This was the height of this process, and it was right around this time when glass blowing was invented. And when glass blowing, offhand glass blowing, was invented, this incredible labor-intensive technique disappeared for a long time. There was still some little bits of Marini, but this deeply intense pattern cane, the things that Matthew does so incredibly well, they were gone from the record until Giacomo Franchini and his father, and then some other people, rediscovered this possibility. And one thing that I think is so interesting about Marini, the reason I'm telling you about Marini is just like Matthew was saying, that he feels like an explorer and he doesn't always know where he's going. I think this idea of building Marini, so for those of you that don't know what we're talking about here, the Marini is like making a cinnamon roll. You make this image and you roll it, stretch it out, and then everywhere you slice it has the same pattern inside. And on something like this, or on Matthew's, you saw that image before, there are many component parts that are made separately and then put together. And every time you stretch that out, the information gets more dense, which is to say, it's sort of like ancient fiber optics. You know, we have fiber optics now drawn out so thin, and it can carry so much information across such distances. But Marini, also called mosaic glass and sometimes millefiori, is that. It is that in a glassy way, and it is one of the first really glassy techniques that exists. And one of the things that I think is interesting about it as a conceptual framework is that it can shift. Depending on how good you are at that technique, depending on how you pull it, the information that you're sending can be different at the beginning or the end. So I show you these two images because it's the same portrait, but they're from different slices of cane. And Vittorio Emanuele looks different in the two of them. So Franchini developed this technique of making these mosaics hot, all together hot in the flame. And he went mad doing this, and he spent the last decades of his life in an insane asylum and left no successor to this technique. I know. You know, for those of you that have gotten the glass bug, it's like not so hard to believe that this could happen. Huh? Right. And there were people that discovered, you know, that picked up Marini and worked Marini in different ways. There's all sorts of things. I'm not going to go into that history. But it really wasn't until Dinah and then Lauren figured out how to make these cane in the 90s that this way of working came back. And now is wide practice. But when Dinah started to do this, nobody was really working in this way. I mean, in this particular intense way. And one of the things that I think is incredible about this method of working, about the idea of the information that's compressed in Marini, is what Matthew kind of talked about before. And this image is thank you to Matthew for sending me. Because what I think is incredible about this cane and about any sort of looking from one center to the periphery of another, or looking at a periphery and thinking it's just that, is when you look at a cane that's pulled, it can seem totally uninteresting. Anything from afar can seem totally uninteresting. And you could convince yourself that you know what's happening in this rod of glass. Like, it's just a black rod of glass. It's got a little red at the end. It's got some clear at the back. But then when you cut it, if you have curiosity, if you shift your perspective, if you go from thinking that you know everything to being curious and turning around and saying, what have I missed? Then, you know, magic can be revealed to you. And so that is a framework that I think is a pretty incredible thing. A pretty incredible thing to know that you can be exactly out in the wilderness making your piece. You could be Matthew at the torch, layering the glass and hoping, you know, have a pretty good idea, hoping. He's really talented. He knows, you know, what's going to happen. But for the rest of us, you know, we don't really know necessarily what's going to be on the end, but to maintain that kind of curiosity. And just because I do have the microphone and because I can in this moment, I will also say that one thing that I think is so incredible about Dinah's work is that she lives in that unknowing. And I think of, in my research process, this is all really a way of really what we're doing here, my friends, is that I'm leading up to tell you about why I'm not telling you about anything else. That's what's happening. It might make sense later, or not, you know. But I feel like this a lot of the time. Look at those jumbled heap at the top. You know, who knows what that is? But when you take the time to arrange it, it becomes this sort of image. And I realized only while I was sitting there before, right before I got up here, and that's why I didn't tell you this earlier. But a part of what this talk is about is really about the kinds of knowing that makers can know, the kinds of ways of research that being so close to your technique, being so close to the flame and to the glass can reveal. Because nobody that hadn't worked on the torch would have been able to understand what Giacomo Franchini was doing or how he even got there. But Dinah could, because she was right here with the material. And that's a pretty incredible thing. So that is available to all of you that are makers in the audience. That's available to you if you listen, you know, if you listen and you ask questions and you go into the research. And for those of us that are not makers, I think it's available for us too in other areas. Okay, orbits. All right, I'm going to tell you another story. This one is about thinking about who our suns are and who we are in orbit around and what that's about. And I'm going to tell you a story about Dudley Giberson, who is one of the first generation of studio glass artists. And he got started working in glass in 1968. I see that you're all trying to read this. I know that's what happens when you put text up, so I'm just going to tell you. This is from an article that he published in 1991, or he published in 1997, about a class that he and Paul taught at Penland in 1991. And Dudley says that he taught everybody how to melt glass, how to anneal glass. He taught how to do it the hot glass way. It was all very serious, he says. And Paul, he says, taught how to buy glass. He was pitching his glass beads in the vermiculite can. He didn't really care about the beads. He was teaching an idea. Paul was reading poems, taking walks. His students were struggling to make one bead at a time. And just in case you weren't clear about what I'm trying to do, and I don't know, again, I said this was new material, I am trying to do it the Paul way. I'm trying to get some ideas across. You know, I am not teaching you the history. Every single thing that I say, I guarantee you at least 30% accuracy. For the rest, you can hit the books. I'm serious. Okay. This is going to be a story about Dudley Giberson, but before it's a story about Dudley Giberson, it's another story about ancient glass. And it's a story about core-form vessels. It's a story about core-form vessels because core-form vessels are some of the first vessels that were ever made in the history of glassworking. Just to give you a sense, this is kind of a timeline of the history of glass. So, you know, the archaeological record isn't totally perfect, but at least by 1450 or so, there was glassworking. And by 1400 or so, BCE, there was core forming. There's core forming later too, but it's this early core forming that we're talking about. And there's no offhand glass blowing until around the year 0. So there's a long time of making glass before there's any glass blowing. And core forming are the first vessels. And what this is a story about is about how how any of us can understand the past and understand the past when we have the knowledge of the present. That's what this is about. So these objects, these really cool objects, little guys, sometimes they're a little bit bigger, they're pretty small, and they have these cool colors, and they have these cool trails, and since the beginning of glass archaeology, people have been fascinated with how they're made. In 1894, like I said, 30% accuracy, you can look it up, a fellow named W.M.F. Petrie, that part's true, had written up his finds at Amarna. Amarna is this important place in glass archaeology because they found all this glass making. But Petrie published about it, and he pontificates about how he thinks these core form vessels are made. But Petrie's not a glass guy. He doesn't have what Dinah has, and he doesn't have what some of the other folks that I'm going to tell you have. He knows about glass blowing. He's seen it. So he just writes, like, the way that they did this was that they wrapped some glass around it. They gathered glass out of a crucible. And forever, for many, many years, for like, you know, decades and decades and decades, everybody's like, you know, we haven't found any glass factories in Egypt, in the ancient record, because we're looking for these things that are based on glass blowing. And there's all these different people that come up with ideas. Petrie said it was gathered from a crucible. Nobody's found that, right? This guy Schuler, who's writing in 1962, is like, there are 6 ways these core form vessels could have been made. He's like, yeah, they could have been made, you know, up at the top right. They could have been made by dipping in, but there's all kinds of problems. How would they have gotten the glass hot enough? The crucibles that we found aren't the right shape. None of this really makes sense. And he says it could be like it could be like a core rolled in frit, in broken up glass. And he says it could be trailed on, and he says it could be cast. And he decides, he tries one other way, which is that he's like, you can dip, you can do something else with the core and the frit. But he tries to do that, and he uses a core that's made out of plaster, which is not an ancient material, and he uses just like some glass, you know, from wherever, and it doesn't work. And he's like, well, that didn't work, can't be that. And he tries some other ways, and he's like, it's core formed, right? And it's probably not. But he's writing in 1962, and he's a really serious dude. In 1962 is, you know, before there's tons and tons of people working with glass in an artistic way all the time. In 1966, a luminary of the burgeoning studio glass scene, Dominic Labino, who was a glass scientist, he had all sorts of reasons for people to believe him, writes this article called The Egyptian Sand Core Technique, a New Interpretation. But he's basically just saying what Petrie had said in 1884, more or less. And he says, the way that the glass is put on is that it's in a furnace, and it looks just like the furnaces that we use today, just by happenstance, because this is the tool that we have. We think it must have happened like that. And somebody gathered some glass on the end of a different rod, and they trailed it on the surface, and then they marvered it. And that really stuck in people's heads. It really stuck in people's heads until there were some other misunderstandings of it, like this one in National Geographic, published in 1987. I bet you guys didn't know you were spending your Friday night with a historiography of core forming. Here we are. Here we are. And this is important because you wouldn't necessarily think that National Geographic is going to know. Oh, also, by the way, this is like, a lot of times when I speak, there's blasphemy, but there's some real blasphemy coming, and I'm waiting for the lightning bolts. This one is important because it has, in little tiny writing that nobody can see, on the bottom, it says Dr. Bob Brill. And Dr. Bob Brill was the chief scientist at the Corning Museum of Glass. A really serious dude, published a lot of really important things. However, he let this idea that in here, that glass is just being gathered out of a furnace, and that really stuck in people's minds. And then in 1991, and published again in 2012, is Bill Gudenrath. Don't take a picture of this one. The lightning bolts are gonna come right down. Don't do it. Is Bill Gudenrath saying that not only was it wasn't that it was just trailed on top, it was actually plunged right into the glass. And then that idea gets picked up everywhere. It's especially popular with museums. What you can't see is these different YouTube clips are from the Corning Museum of Glass, the Art Institute Chicago, and the Getty Museum, representing almost 100,000 views of this particular technique. The idea that you put a core right into the glass, which kind of is mind-boggling. Like if you think of anything that you happen to know about ancient glass, like these little tiny guys, these little tiny things that are like so precious. All the glass is so small and precious in this time. And suddenly they're gonna be just like, you know, dipping the rod into the glass, this precious material, this core, with a core on the end that's made of like dung. They're gonna put poop into their fancy glass that they traded across. No, they're not. No, they're probably not gonna do that. That is a way of thinking. Like that's like, you know, the saying, if you're a surgeon, you know, everything, like you got your one tool, you got your scalpel. You know, that's what it is. But the whole time, before any of this is published, there are other, or alongside these there are other people. There are other people advocating other ways. And these people happen to be folks with experience with glass that isn't necessarily only blown glass. So Keith Cumming, in his 1980 book, The Technique of Glass Forming, he writes, hey, you know, everybody got really stoked about this idea of trailing glass on the surface or dipping glass into the pot. That doesn't seem that doesn't seem right. But you know, this guy Schuler in 1962, he suggested that you could put frit on a core, and like somebody should really do that, you know? And Mary Ann Stern in 1994, she says the same thing. She's like, she is an experimental archaeologist, which means she's somebody that does the archaeology, digging the things up, but then she also tries to recreate the ways that it would have been at the time. Like there's some indication that the early blowpipes are ceramic. And so she's like, can you blow glass with a ceramic blowpipe? And she tries to recreate the conditions, and it turns out she could. You know, interesting stuff, like thinking like a maker. Another luminary in early studio glass, to digress a moment, is a fellow named Irwin Eisch. And Irwin Eisch has one of my very most favorite statements that I've ever heard, which is, there's a lot of thinking in the hands. You know, there's a lot of thinking in the hands. And what Mary Ann Stern does in recreating, or trying to recreate the conditions, ancient conditions, is put those thinking hands to work. So in this incredible book, Early Glass of the Ancient World in 1994, she's like, you know, somebody should really go back to this thing that Fred Schuler said about working with cores and frit. Somebody should do that. And it turned out somebody was thinking just along those lines. And that is our pal, Dudley Giberson, who we met in the beginning from his class with Paul, where he was teaching very serious stuff. And this just gives you a little sense of Dudley Giberson. Like, he's a cool guy. And he was a maker. He started as a blower, but he was really interested in beads, and he had started making beads from tubes, and he was thinking about ancient beads, and he really made an incredible mark in the studio glass movement in equipment. Like, he became an equipment guy. And people that are equipment guys are also thinking about what are the conditions What are the conditions of historical stuff? And he put his mind to that. And coming back from that class that he and Paul taught in 1991, he had this dream. Oh, here it is. He had a dream. And this is the dream. I don't have an image of it because the images he has are really like not very good computer, like Web 1.0 images. So I'm going to build this for you right now. This is his dream. He thought about the fireplace, just like cooking outside fireplace. And he thought, what if you raised the walls and you made, I didn't think about doing it with the microphone in hand, so I'm going to tell you, and then I will do it. He thought about, like, what if you raise the wall so you make sort of like a volcano? You make a volcano, and you have the fire inside, and the air drafts to come in. And he had this dream that could be a way that you could make glass beads and other things. He had this dream, and what that is really, is all of these blowers, all these people that think through rod and the furnace is over here and this is how you get the glass. They could only imagine a furnace like that. But what Dudley dreamt about is essentially a furnace that's a torch. It's a directed flame. It's a torch that you can it's a flame that you can selectively heat your glass on. It is flame working. And soon after he had that idea, he was looking in a book, Lois Sher-Dubin's The History of Beads from 30,000 BC to the present, published in 1987, so just a few years before he had this vision. And he saw that the glassmakers in Bida, Nigeria, use furnaces just like that. In the 70s and 80s, they were using these furnaces, and he was like, oh, I'm onto something. And he had been thinking about core forming the whole time. But he said, when I began the journey, I did not suspect that the very current views as proposed by Dominic Labino in 1966 and supported by such notables as Robert Brill and others, including the prestigious would be the very blinders that kept new insight from view. Like, it was, these big suns, the big suns, had a big idea, and it blocked out any other kind of idea. But he's still turning it around, and he's thinking about this bead furnace, where he was successfully making beads on it in this beehive sort of way. And he's got to thinking about the glass in those core form vessels, and how you never see transparent glass. You always see this kind of mottled surface, which reminded him of pâté de verre, like a kiln casting using glass particles. And he was thinking about that, and I don't even know if he knew about Fred Schuller's dipping the core method from 1962. I'm not sure he knew about it, but he just was sort of like dreaming about it and thinking about how could you make glass that would be like that would be used in the way that has the reverence for the material that was clearly at play in ancient Egypt. And so he figured out how to do it. He came up with, he started making these cores. He would make them wet, and he would fire them, and then he would layer on glass, wet glass, out of the heat. And you have to tap them on, and he has this really cool video that I'm not showing you, but it's a cool video, and you can find it, where basically it's making pâté de verre, and then you heat them up, and then you can add, using his furnace, this beehive furnace that's basically like a torch, you can add glass around it. You can add it it's flame working. He figured that out. He figured that out because he kept going, and because he didn't have, he wasn't part of any sun. He was his own solar system. And then even though 5,000 Years of Glass, which was published by the British Museum, even though they keep saying that the glass is plunged into, that the cores are plunged into molten glass, Keith Cumming, who had written in 1980, Somebody Should Explore This, when he publishes his new book in 2002, he's like, hey, look at what Dudley Giberson did. And Marianne Stern, she's quoted on the back. It's cooler than showing you something from JSTOR, kind of. She's quoted on the back of Dudley's book from an article that she published, where she was like, Dudley Giberson has proven that this is how these objects were made. And yet, if you just go on the internet, what you will find is this glass blower-centric way of thinking. Because it's cool, it's easy to understand, it makes a good video, and because the sons are saying it, the sons are saying it. Which is two things, it's two things. One, it's important to know who your son is. It's just important. It's just important to know. What are they in it for? Where is their research process coming from? It's important to know who your son is, but it's also important to know that we don't know everything. We don't know everything. It can be out there, it can look like it's published, but we don't know. You might know one day, right? You might be on the cusp of knowing right now. You might be working on knowing the thing that you don't even know that you're figuring out right now. Maybe somebody's giving you a gift like Paul gave me about the microphone all those years ago. You don't know. And to illustrate a kind of not knowing that I didn't know, and maybe you don't know either, but that blows my mind, is, oh, no, I remember. You know what? Guys, I made myself presenter notes. I just forgot to look at them. So this is what I also wanted to say. This is what I also wanted to say here. Defining the past through the tools of the present is a mental block. Like trying to understand a technique at the margins of the known using only the most common tools of the present is likely to fail. Like nobody was trying to, there's no bad faith in all these glassblowers that are like, in the past it was glassblowing. It's just that that's what they knew. That's how they knew how to think. So that is alive for all of us when we think about the past in anything. We think with the tools that we know. And that's also true about the future we imagine for ourselves. We think about the future, we build the future with the tools that we currently have. But how cool to build a future, to imagine a future for ourselves using tools we can't imagine yet. What if we thought about where we were trying to go and then figured out how to get there? Wouldn't that be something? So think about that. Good thing I made myself a note. But there's something else I wanted to say, because thinking about these guys in Nigeria, thinking about these glass bead makers in Nigeria using the kind of beehive furnace that Dudley Giberson had imagined, actually makes me think about some other kind of horizons and our other understanding of the history. Because for almost all of my knowledge of glass, like all of my learning in glass, my teaching at RISD, all of it, if you look in almost any single book, the story of glass is that it was discovered in Mesopotamia, came to its height in Egypt, and then became a material of contact. Like it went all over the place, but it went all over the place through trade or through contact, which means like in the Americas and Africa and many places, it is a colonial material. But you guys, we don't know. We don't know. Because look at this. Look at this. There is incredible scholarship by Nigerian archaeologists, including this work by Abidemi Babatunde Babalola, from just a couple of years ago, which is they have found and established, actually they found them a long time ago, but nobody thought it was important enough to study, and everybody had the idea in their head that to make glass you needed to have big furnaces and things needed to look one way, so nobody looked at it. But Professor Babalola and his colleagues have shown that there was primary glassmaking, that means glassmaking from the raw materials in Nigeria 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago. And not just beyond a shadow of a doubt. And that is so many years before European colonists and colonizers were there. There is nothing but things we don't know in the world. And just to give you a sense, this is our timeline. This is core forming, this is whatever, there's the Frankinis, but 1,000 years ago, at least. That is a long time. And just in case you are sitting there thinking, well, there was glassmaking in Egypt, so like they probably got it from ancient Egypt, it just came over. Africa is so big. It's so big that to drive from Lagos, Nigeria, to Cairo is 4,000 miles. 4,000 miles, 2,400 miles, and as the crow flies, as they say. If you think about that, 4,000 miles driving, it is only 2,900 miles from New York City to San Francisco. And there's actually so much more that I have to say about Nigerian glass. Oh man, I could really talk about it, but I see that I'm at 38 minutes. And I have key takeaways for this section and a little bit more, you guys, so I'm gonna keep going. So I think we just did the takeaways, but just in case, the world is full of things we don't know. Just imagine all the things we don't know yet. Be careful of who your sons are, with a U. I guess also with an O, but be careful of who your sons are. And sometimes artists and research equals magic. This is a plug, shameless plug. I wrote the foreword to Bandhu's new edition of this book, and I felt very privileged and honored to do that, but I really did. But even more than that, reading the historical section of that book, I was like, what I have never read. The world is full of things I haven't read, right? But I have never read as thorough and detailed a history of modern lampworking as is in this book. And I thought to myself, this is so incredible. This is what an artist can do. Somebody with skin in the game, can do. And anyway, so that's a pretty cool thing. There you go. Okay, this one I'll try to be fast. I'm trying to tell you all of these things because I'm giving you these stories. I'm giving you these stories from the history of glass and from the history of the world, but I'm also trying to articulate to you how I think about things, how I approach the work that I do. And to do that now, I'm actually going to use a different artist's work that I also just wrote about, an artist named Helen Lee, who works a lot with language and knowledge and transmission and understanding through glass. And in this work called anechoic, she made blown glass vessels that when you slice them, they had letters, they revealed letters. And she installed these, this was like her graduate thesis show at RISD, and she installed these on the gallery windows, which meant that the words are totally there. They are concrete, they are made out of glass, these letters. But when you look at them, you can't even really see them. You can't even really see them. Like either you're standing outside and you're looking into the darkened gallery space, or you're standing inside and it's everything chaotic outside. You can't really see it. And what that means to me, the way that I think about that in terms of my own practice, is that one of the things that I am always trying to do, sometimes I think hopefully succeeding, is to try and make the invisible a little bit more visible to people. Make what they can't see a little bit more visible. And Helen is really thinking about this. So this is a work of hers called Obverse Reverse. And this is again about who is in the center and who is in the margin, who understands and who doesn't understand. This is my read, right? Because for most of us in this audience, this looks like a beautiful thing. A beautiful object that maybe we recognize that they're Chinese coins, and maybe we've seen something like this as a feng shui good luck charm. But for most of us, most of you in the audience are like me, that when I looked at this, I didn't have the cultural specificity to understand that there would never be a Chinese good luck charm with 4 coins, because 4 in Mandarin is a homophone for the word death. So there would never be that. So this is already, we're in territory, right? That we are in new territory. You can think about the poetic space that's opened up by a good luck charm that is a homophone for death, an unlucky charm. And that the words on there, well, I can't read those, but I now know that they are also rhyming homophones for different aspects of Helen's experience as a Taiwanese American immigrant, or her parents immigrated. She's second generation. That they are for sound and silence, for life and death. This whole world, there's more and more. This whole world is revealed to people that can understand what's happening in it. And I think that for so many of us, that's what art making, like what art understanding is. A lot of people are really intimidated about art. And I totally get it, because they're like, I don't understand this thing. I don't understand this thing. I don't have a way in. And I hope that that's why there's a reason for people like me that can give a little bit more insight into it, and for people like Helen that teach me. I didn't know any of this stuff, right? I didn't know really any of this stuff. I couldn't articulate any of it until thinking through her work. But it isn't just the words, you know? It's not just about saying exactly what's there. It's about what isn't there, what the feeling of the thing is. And this piece that is called 1F, which is the audio guy notation for pink noise, is a piece that is inspired by Helen's experience of her father, of laying her head on his chest as he would speak. And it's not about the words that he said that are represented here by all these thousands of little glass spheres, but it is about the way that his presence manifested itself, like the breath, his breath going in and out. I mean, I hope that you all have an experience of resting your head on somebody's chest or their stomach and hearing the life that is inside. You know, that is a kind of communication that's beyond all sorts of words. And here I'll play you just a little bit. Sounds like the ocean, but it sounds like the breath. It's a remembering that we are all part of this bigger unfolding thing. And I think that that is an incredible power of works, of artworks. I hope that there's some part of me, the person that is me, that's connecting with the person that is you right now. I told you all of that. It might have been good for me to tell you this section before any of this stuff, but I tell you all of those things because I think of myself, I do think of myself as a bridge, or what I like to do is be a bridge. Bridge is connect peripheries. Bridges connect over peripheries and bring information from one place to another. And that is what I hope that I do, and that is what I'm trying to do right now. All of this is a big way of saying, I thought I was going to tell you, I had an idea in my head that I was going to tell you about the project that I'm working on now. And then I started thinking about how I would go about doing that, and I was like, I can't do that. I'm really in the middle of it. I'm in the middle of it in this exploratory research like Matthew was talking about. I am in the thick of it. I am like those slides, the Marini that Dinah Hewlett made that I showed you at the end of that section, where it just looks like a jumble and I can't show you it, but I can tell you what it is. I am working on an exhibition that I first dreamed of more than 22 years ago, probably around 22 years ago, the cannabis pipe exhibition of my dreams. And I am trying to work on that project in the manner that I have shown you all the way across, which is to say, there have been there's been a handful of exhibitions that have treated the topic, but for me, what they do is they just take that knowledge from one place and they just kind of drop it into a museum, and it doesn't have the context, it doesn't have the feeling, it doesn't have the cultural resonance, it's not situated. Another thing I learned from Paul Stanker that has been an important reverberation in my life is that Paul always says, I think, to many people, that the thing is you have to put your work in a historical context. You have to put your work in a historical context, and for me, that's what I am trying to do. That's what I guess I ended up trying to do with my career, and that's what I'm trying to do with this pipe exhibition. And so I will end sort of with an echo of where I began, which is with Bell Hook's center margin theory. You don't really have to totally know this, and I have to give the credit where it's due, and the place it's due is to Davin Ebanks, who teaches at Kent State, and who, for the first time this semester, is teaching flameworking. So he's part of the team now. When I was talking to him I just happened to be talking to him, and I told him about what I was going to talk about, and he was like, oh yeah, that's Bell Hooks' center margin theory. And I was like, oh, I think I read about that once, but I need to look back into it. And what there's a lot of things in there, and you can look it up, and you can also look up this cool explainer on a website called Primary Goals, which is a nice way to get there quickly. But one of the things that she talks about is that the center always thinks that the margin should come to them. The center always is kind of unaware that they're the center, and the center always thinks that the margin should come to them. But she says, really, what should happen is that the center goes to the margin, and tries to understand what's happening there. And so it is my incredible honor and privilege to be getting to do that on this exhibition that I'm working on that will open in August of 2026 at a museum that I can't disclose yet. And I feel like maybe that wasn't the right place to end. I should have ended before when I was talking about core forming. But nonetheless, this is the place that I'm ending. So sorry, y'all. sorry.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions tops.
I don't know if I actually have a question other than to say that was incredible. Like, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate seeing sort of the African context. And, you know, I've been doing a little bit of reading about some of the furnaces that are found like in Zanzibar and along the Swahili coast. And so it's you know, it's very easy for us to lose sight of how global and material this is. You know, it's easy for us to forget that glass sort of co-erupts in China as well. And so it's thank you. I have lots of questions, but I probably have to digest before I ask them.
Thank you. I'm supposed to repeat the question. For the video, which I can't do, but I'm gonna just redirect and say this. So what she was saying, hopefully you guys all heard, was about how incredibly widespread the material of glass is. And one of the things that was something that I was really looking forward to doing in Corning with the curatorial team that was there when I was there and isn't there so much anymore, was that we were thinking about the history of glass, reinstalling the history of glass. And one of the things that we came to in that process was that one of the most important glass types for the most people across the most places for the most time, and that's almost entirely left out of every glass book, are beads, as you mentioned. So that's like one thing I left on the field that I am like, oh, that would be so cool to work on.
Have you looked into the beads that were made by the Vikings in Berka in Sweden?
So the question was, have I looked into the beads that were made by the Vikings in, I can't say it with such a good accent, Berka, Sweden? And the answer is no, I'm not really a bead researcher. I mean, I read about beads like a person that's interested, that sits around and reads things about glass and history, but I am not a bead scholar or really a ancient scholar, but I should.
Me too.
Okay, so she said that she was grateful that I talked about core forming because she studied that in school, but it was presented like it was the gathered way. Yeah, and she was wondering if I thought there was pushback from glass blowers about that. I want to just, I realized that I did a disservice. I don't think there's a real like glass blower flame worker thing. I don't really think that. I think that there's, I think people just don't like know. And so I think it's just like Dudley Giberson said when he was looking into this, that the idea that like big time guys were saying it was made in this way was just an impediment to thinking in new ways. So I don't think that, but I do think that those videos are still out there and that explanation is still on prominent websites all over the glass world. So, and not out of like, I think probably not out of like, it must have been done this way, but like out of things linger and new ideas are hard to have, and that's why it's so amazing that you guys all are makers, right? Because it is so hard to make new things and new ideas all the time. And I think people don't know. I think people don't know. So now you know, and you can bring that information to other folks, because now you have it. Anybody else? You don't have to.
All right, you're sticking around all weekend, right?
Yeah, mostly.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Susie.